Welcome to Plot Twist Radio, the show where creativity, storytelling, and the unpredictable path of the creative life all collide. I'm your host, Erin Egnatz.
Hi, Bill. Welcome to Plot Twist Radio. Before we get going, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
My name is Bill Holst. I was an avionics systems engineer for 38 years, and I also just happen to be the stepson of Alan Hovhaness. So I'll be talking about Alan today.
Very cool. And for listeners meeting him for the first time, who was Alan?
Alan was probably one of the most prolific classical composers of the 20th century. He had well over 500 compositions, and 67 of those were symphonies. He was an Armenian American composer. He had kind of the Armenian background, but later in his career, he went and toured through India and Korea, Japan. So he also had those other cultures influenced on his music.
Wow, that's amazing. Like you said, he wrote over 500 works and 67 symphonies. How does someone even live at that level of output? That's incredible.
Yes, Alan was constantly composing music. I think he started at age 4. His mother couldn't play his compositions on her home organ, so he put that on hold until he was 7. Then he started composing again.
Wow, that's amazing. So what, you said you were his stepson. What made you decide to put this work out?
So basically, it's completing the project that my mom had actually started. Alan was a great storyteller, and he would sit up with my mother at night and talk about different composers, Sibelius, Beethoven, Bach, and tell stories about them. Not only their musical stories, but also their personal stories and their affairs and things of that nature. My mother was very much interested in that. And so after Alan's passing, she felt that everyone should know about Alan, not only his music, but his personality. And so she had firsthand knowledge of all those experiences. She wanted to capture that in a book. And so the book was originally trying to be a documentary to, document important dates and musical events, but it ended up becoming a very heartfelt love story. So it goes through kind of all of the phases of different types of love through Alan's lifetime, So originally when they first met, it was kind of the romantic period, and then the family sort of love. And then as he became sick, the love between my mother and him, going through the hard times of dealing with all the medical issues and everything. And then at the end, it was my mother's longing for, missing her partner.
So you've described it it's structured like a composition, movements, themes, dissonance, release. What does that look like on the page?
So what my mother did was she captured basically her book was based on diary entries. So she kept daily diary, and as she went through it, these stories are kind of in chronological order of the diary entries. However, a lot of those entries, talk about things that happened in the past. So it's not necessarily the things that actually happen are chronological. It's chronological for what her diary entry was. And so these are short stories of different things that happened to them, or memories of certain things. She'll be walking through the house and she'll see an object, and that reminded me of the time Alan and I did this, and so that kind of an order in the book.
Gotcha. Was it challenging to keep it emotionally honest without turning it into a traditional biography timeline?
Yes. So my mother and I had talked a lot about this book, and she had read the stories to me several times. And she let me know exactly what she wanted. And at the time, she was looking for a publisher. She started getting sick. And so basically, she left a draft copy of the book. I went out and I found a publisher. And that was one thing that we struggled with, and I stayed firm with, is that, we didn't want it as, kind of literary masterpiece. We just wanted to capture her personality and Alan's personality. And I think that's kind of what it did. She always said that she wanted to keep the Orientalness in her writing. And, there were parts where, it had to be corrected, but we tried to keep, as much of her personality into the book as we possibly could.
Yes. And I think you did a good job of that. There's a line that I really love. It says, "Your mother didn't try to protect Alan, she revealed him." Why was that important? For more like a personal side for the reader, or just for your own personal need?
Well, I think she really wanted to capture historically, like I say, going back to those stories that Alan used to say is that it's not necessarily all the good things. We don't want to, build it up like he was a perfect human being. He wanted to look human. And so there are good things and there's bad things. And so she tried to capture as much about Alan's true personality as she could in the book.
Gotcha. So we know him as the composer, but in daily life, what was Alan like?
Alan was a pretty calm guy. Throughout the day, he would go off and he would do his composing, but he always had time. Whenever my family went over there, he always had time for family. We would go to their house on a weekly basis, generally on Sunday evenings, and have dinner with them. And so we'd all sit around the table and have discussions, and Alan would tell stories of his, younger days while my mother was cooking dinner. And then after dinner, we would go into the living room, and Alan would basically have a piano concert for the family, and we'd all listen.
Very cool. So tell us a little bit about his pieces. What are the 3 pieces that you recommend listeners beginning with?
So listeners that are maybe not used to, long symphonies, I would recommend one of his shorter piano pieces, like Storm on Mount Wildcat. That's a very short piece that, a lot of activity going on, short amount of time. But someone who may be more used to a symphony, definitely his masterpiece was Mysterious Mountain. I'd also recommend the Rubaiyat, and then Mount St. Helens Symphony.
Very nice. I was listening to a few of his pieces before the interview, and I have to say, it feels like out of this world. I don't think I've ever heard compositions quite like that. Where did he get his inspiration from? Do you know?
His inspiration was always, I guess, nature. He liked very rugged mountains that had, snow-covered mountains with the storm. That was kind of his inspiration. As a matter of fact, the house that he lived in Seattle had a picture view of Mount Rainier, which is very, snow-covered mountain there in Seattle. Alan always said that he heard music in his head, even when he was, very young, and he thought everyone did. And so I kind of saw him, in tune with nature, and, the universe was kind of talking to him, and he was able to translate that into music. And so, he's kind of translating, what the trees, the mountains, the wind is saying, and then putting into music. So I think, all of his music is, very, very natural, spiritual, mystical.
I love it. So let's talk about the writing process for you. What was it like? Was it like late nights?
So I didn't do most of the text of the book. My mother did 100% of the internal text. We did the acknowledgement, the different parts. We went off and had people give little write-ups or reviews or whatever, and pretty much did all the editing, the design work, capturing all the pictures, getting all the pictures and the rights to those. That was the most difficult part. And then, of course, doing the design work on the cover, the sides of it and everything. So that's pretty much what we did. But my mother did 100% of the actual text of the book.
So how about the publishing process? Because everyone has a publishing story. It's usually a nightmare from what I've gathered from others. What was your story like?
Well, actually, it was kind of smooth. Publisher was open to whatever we wanted. But like I said, up front, we did have a little difficulty with saying we want to capture exactly my mother's voice. But other than that, we had a fairly smooth time. I mean, of course, we did a lot of editing, and that went back and forth for a long period of time. And then the most difficult part was actually getting the rights to the pictures. Some of those pictures are 60, 70 years old or older, and finding who actually owned those was a real task.
That can be very challenging. Yeah, I've had to deal with that on the other side of my job, and it's like its own puzzle. You need like a detective to figure it out sometimes, but
Right.
You guys did a fantastic job with it. I was going through it, and I was really, really amazed. I didn't know of Alan before this, but he seemed like a really captivating guy.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm trying to get out there is that, we knew Alan and I were very good friends. I mean, we actually had a relationship that wasn't stepfather, stepson. It was more of a friendship kind of thing. And that's kind of what I want to do is let everyone know that there was more to Alan than just his music. That was kind of the product of Alan and his personality, is that he knew quite a few people in the music world in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. He actually went to school with Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, and they were actually he had an incident at Tanglewood. He had earned a scholarship at Tanglewood, and like I said, they were in his class. And one of the classes, you would bring your composition, and the class would listen to it, and then kind of give comments and reviews afterwards. So when it was time for Alan to do his composition, Aaron Copland was talking very loudly over the playing of it, and then afterwards, Leonard Bernstein called it ghetto music, and that was such a traumatic impact on Alan that he actually left Tanglewood and he destroyed over 1,000 pieces of his compositions. However, I think that was a very good thing, because after that, then he decided to kind of reinvent himself. And that's when he went off and he studied in India, Korea, and Japan. And he studied not only their music styles, their ancient styles, but he also lived the culture. And so, he put that into his music, but he also had, many beliefs that came out of that. So I don't know if this kind of is your background or not, but there's a lot of historical things there. He also believed in reincarnation, and so he had a psychic friend that told him that he was also a musician during the Egyptian times, and the cat that he had in the 1930s was also in that time with him in the Egyptian times, and they were reincarnated at the same time in the 1930s. He also said that Alan was a gentleman during Leonardo da Vinci's time. His name was Antolante Migliatori, which was one of Michelangelo's students, who was also a musician. And I kind of looked into a little bit of his background, and he seemed to have the same exact characteristics as Alan. Very spiritual in his music, didn't change his method of composing to satisfy anyone. It was, what he believed in, very, beautiful, spiritual kind of music. And so they seem to have the same type of personality. So, there's a little bit of that mysteriousness behind Alan.
I love that. I love that. First, that he took the time to, not let it really, it got to him, obviously. He withdrew from school, but he took lemons and made lemonade with it. And it probably had a lot to do with why his music was so good. But the reincarnation, I'm totally interested in, as I've always been, a lot of people know me as a ghost hunter. So I've always been fascinated by the reincarnation. So that's very interesting, especially that you were able to look up his, what did you say his name was, from Michelangelo's time? That's very
Antolante Migliatori.
That is very interesting. That's cool that you were able to draw the parallels there. Very interesting. Love that.
And like I say, Alan had many contacts in the music world, from the 30s through 70s. I mean, in the late 50s, early 60s, he was living in New York City, and there was a small group of artists and musicians that kind of hung together. And there was three: John Cage, Alan, and Yoko Ono were a small group. And so Alan used to tell me stories about we were driving around Manhattan. Yoko would be reciting her poetry to him. And he had many connections with, like Woodstock. He knew several people who played at Woodstock. As a matter of fact, just the other day, my wife and I were watching a video about the Monterey Pop Festival, 1967, Summer of Love, and Ravi Shankar was actually played there. And I don't know if you're familiar with Ravi Shankar, but he's a very, very famous sitar player from India. He had big influence on the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's, the Byrds, Doors, Rolling Stones. I think they all had sitar players. And so that movement in the 60s was kind of this big thing. But Alan actually, in his travels in the 50s, had met Ravi Shankar before. And he is kind of the one who promoted heavily Ravi before that. And I don't know, actually, I looked this up on AI. I don't know if I can read this to you or not.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So it says, one particularly important example occurred in 1956. According to a record record producer, George Hovhaness contacted him and insisted that he met a terrific musician from India. A few minutes later, Hovhaness arrived at Avakian's door with Ravi Shankar. That introduction led to Shankar's early American recording opportunities, including albums released in the United States, some with liner notes written by Hovhaness himself. So I guess he's not credited for actually bringing him over, but he had introduced him to a lot of the recording. So we kind of take credit for him introducing him to America.
Absolutely. And you should. I love that because I actually am a fan of Ravi. I'm a George Harrison fan. I named my youngest son George Harrison. That's his name. Yeah. So I've always listened to Ravi. So I thank you guys for that. That is wonderful. So where can the audience find you and the book?
Yeah. We have a website. It's alanhovhanessmusic.com. And so that website, you can purchase the book on there. It also kind of gives a little bit of history, kind of what I had talked about, gives my mother's family history. And then, of course, it has a playlist of recommended music on there also that you can directly link to some music.
Perfect. I will make sure that link is in the show notes for everyone. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing Alan's story.
All right. Thank you.